The morning was supposed to be like any other. A quiet Saturday in my cabin by the lake, the sun casting gentle rays on the calm water. I was pulling out my little inflatable kayak from the shed, preparing for a peaceful paddle around the lake, a routine that had become my solace. The air was crisp, fresh, with the scent of pine trees lingering in every breath I took. It was a reprieve from the world, a small piece of paradise I had worked so hard to claim. This cabin meant everything to me. It wasn't just a house by the water, it was a connection to my past, to memories of summers spent with my dad, who had passed away years ago. This place held my peace, my healing. I had been coming here since I was a kid, camping by the lake with him, until it hurt too much to come back after he died. But when I finally bought the cabin 3 years ago, it felt like fate had brought me home. I thought this would be the place where I could breathe, where I could find some form of healing after years of turmoil. But as I was inflating my kayak, something completely unexpected happened. I didn't know it at the time, but that seemingly innocent Saturday morning was about to turn into something far darker. The sirens started quietly, at first distant, then growing louder, drawing nearer. My first thought was that there must be some emergency down the road, but then the sirens became almost deafening. I froze in place, the pump still in my hand. I looked up, confused, as 3 police cars, lights flashing, came screeching down my street. They didn't slow down or ease their approach. They barreled toward my cabin, cutting through the tranquility I had once cherished. The cars stopped right in front of my cabin, the officers jumping out with urgency, hands on their belts. They approached me cautiously, eyes scanning, unsure what they were walking into. I was standing there, in casual clothes, holding a kayak pump. The scene looked absurd, like some kind of mistake. The lead officer, an older man with graying hair, asked me for my name. I was too stunned to speak at first, but when I nodded, he told me why they were there. "We received a 911 call about trespassing and suspicious activity at this address," he said, looking at me like I was some criminal about to be caught. "Someone reported an unauthorized person with suspicious equipment on the property." I stared at him, then glanced at my kayak, half inflated on the lawn. I couldn't help but laugh. "Officer, this is my house. This is my kayak. I'm just inflating it so I can go for a paddle," I explained, bewildered by the absurdity of the situation. But the officers had to do their job. They were here, and they had to respond. Even when it was obviously ridiculous, they had to check. I felt a mix of anger and humiliation as they asked me for identification, a simple request that somehow felt like an invasion. I went inside, grabbed my ID, and returned to the officers. I could see Agnes, the HOA president, watching from her window, her face barely visible behind the blinds. It was clear she was enjoying the chaos she had created. The officers went through the motions of verifying my documents, and once everything checked out, the lead officer turned to me, his voice tinged with a certain weariness. "Mr. Turner, have you had issues with your HOA?" His tone said it all. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and it wouldn't be the last. The truth hit me like a ton of bricks. Agnes had called the cops on me over something as trivial as a kayak. This wasn't about the rules. It was about power. She had weaponized the system against me, using the police to harass me, to humiliate me, all because I dared to challenge her authority. When the officers left, I stood there, staring at my half-inflated kayak. The neighbors who had gathered to see what was going on started to drift back to their homes. Not one person came to ask if I was okay. Not one person came to offer support. It was like I was already branded as a troublemaker. I had become the pariah of the neighborhood. But what hurt the most wasn't the flashing lights, the sirens, or the uncomfortable stares. It wasn't even the public spectacle she had orchestrated. It was the fact that Agnes had invaded the one space that was sacred to me. This cabin wasn't just a house. It was where I healed. And now, it felt tainted by her actions. I realized something in that moment. This wasn't just petty HOA drama anymore. Agnes had crossed a line. She was no longer just harassing me. She had made it personal. And from that moment, I wasn't going to just take it lying down. I knew this wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The days after that first incident were filled with an almost unbearable tension. The sirens, the flashing lights, the police cars pulling up to my house, all of it replayed in my mind like a nightmare I couldn't shake off. Agnes, with her smug smile, had used the police to create a spectacle, a scene that made me feel small, insignificant, and helpless. The sense of violation, the knowledge that she had turned my life upside down, it gnawed at me every single day. What hurt even more was the cold, silent judgment of my neighbors. It was as though they had all silently agreed that I was the troublemaker. The gossip had already started. I could see it in their eyes whenever I left the house or went down to the lake. They weren't concerned for me. No one came by to offer help or even a word of support. They just watched. I had always loved this place. It was my sanctuary. But now, it was tainted. The beauty of the lake, the serene mornings, the quiet nights. It all felt so distant, so foreign. All I could think about was Agnes and her insidious reach into my life. She had somehow turned my paradise into a battleground, and I was no longer sure I could fight back. But I wasn't about to back down. This was my home. My father's legacy. I wasn't going to let some power-hungry HOA president drive me out. I began researching her. I needed to know exactly who I was dealing with. I started by going through the HOA's regulations, my purchase papers, anything that could give me a legal footing. That's when I first stumbled upon something unsettling. The rules. The very rules she was enforcing were dubious at best. I had been receiving violation notices for the smallest things, a garden, a kayak, and every single one of them seemed to be based on arbitrary and conflicting standards. I couldn't help but think, why was she doing this? What was her endgame? The garden was a simple, well-maintained patch of basil and mint. The kayak? A simple inflatable boat for peaceful paddling. But Agnes, she saw these as violations. She had created rules that didn't exist, rules that could only serve to control people. And the more I looked into it, the clearer it became, she wasn't just enforcing rules. She was creating an oppressive environment where no one dared to speak up, where anyone who did was made into a target. The more I researched, the more I realized how deep the problem ran. This wasn't just about me. Agnes had been doing this for months, targeting anyone who didn't comply with her twisted vision of what the community should be. The complaints, the fines, the constant surveillance. She was making everyone live in fear of breaking some hidden rule. It was like living in a dictatorship disguised as a community. She had everyone walking on eggshells, afraid to speak out, afraid to live their lives in peace. But I wasn't afraid. No. I was angry. One night, after another round of feeling like a prisoner in my own home, I went for a walk by the lake. I needed to clear my mind, to process everything that had happened. I remember walking along the shore, feeling the cool breeze on my face, watching the ripples in the water. I realized something profound in that moment. Agnes had pushed me to a point where I couldn't just ignore it anymore. This wasn't about fines or rules. This was about taking back control of my life, about not letting someone destroy everything I had worked so hard for. But it wasn't just me. There were others. I started to talk to my neighbors. Slowly at first. I needed to know if anyone else had been pushed to the edge like I had. And what I discovered shocked me. I wasn't the only one. Agnes had been systematically harassing multiple families, making their lives miserable for the smallest of infractions. Mark, the architect who lived across the street, had been fined for working in his garage. Stella, the photographer, had been fined for displaying her artwork. Every single person I talked to had a story about Agnes using her position to manipulate the HOA's rules, to make people's lives harder. That's when the idea started to form. What if we all stood together? What if we could take her down? But how? How could I, just a guy with a kayak and a cabin by the lake, take on someone with so much power? Agnes had built a system of fear around her. She had weaponized the HOA to control people, to make them pay for the privilege of living in this place. But she had made one fatal mistake. She had crossed me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, turning everything over in my mind. I knew what I had to do. It wasn't just about fighting Agnes. It was about standing up for everyone in the community who had been too scared to speak out. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about reclaiming our neighborhood, our peace, our freedom. And it started with one simple thing. Fighting back. I woke up the next morning with a sense of clarity. The quiet determination I had felt the night before was stronger than ever. Agnes may have thought she had the upper hand, but in reality, she had handed me the very tools I needed to expose her. That 911 call? It wasn't just a stupid mistake on her part. It was a golden opportunity. The officers had made a report, they had documented her harassment, and most importantly, there was now an official record of the abuse. That was my starting point. I spent the rest of the morning digging into the legalities of HOA operations. I started reading through the original HOA charter. It wasn't easy, and at first, I didn't understand half of it, but then I hit something that made my pulse quicken. It was buried deep in the fine print. Any new regulations affecting individual property rights must be approved by a majority vote of all community residents. This wasn't just a procedural detail. This was huge. Agnes hadn't just broken the rules. She had been actively ignoring them. I felt a sense of vindication. All this time, I had thought I was being punished for trivial things, my garden, my kayak, but it wasn't just petty HOA drama. This was a systematic attempt to control the entire community without their consent. She had been making up rules as she went along, forcing them on people, collecting fines, and even making up fake violations to profit from. It wasn't just corruption, it was theft. I knew this wasn't something I could handle on my own. This was going to take more than just me. I needed allies, people who had been wronged, people who were ready to take action. So, I started talking to my neighbors. I went door to door, trying to get people to listen. At first, they were hesitant. They had been living in fear for so long, so beaten down by Agnes's tactics, that they didn't believe anything could change. But then, when I started showing them the documents. When I showed them the original charter, the financial records, the violation notices they had received, they started to wake up. This wasn't just a personal fight. This was about their homes, their rights, and their future in this community. Davies, my elderly neighbor who had been around since the beginning, was the first to truly get it. He had lived through the development of the neighborhood, and he kept meticulous records of everything. He even had a collection of old HOA documents that had been long buried under Agnes's updates. When I showed him what I had discovered, his eyes lit up. This was exactly what he had been afraid of all along. Agnes had been using the HOA to manipulate the community for her own gain. With his help, I started gathering the real evidence, and what we found was staggering. For weeks, Agnes had been implementing rules without any legal authority. She had been collecting fines for these violations, for things as simple as a garden or a kayak, and the money was going somewhere. Her pockets, I suspected. But proving that would be harder. Still, the fact that she had been operating without the community's consent was all I needed to get started. We had found our opening, and now it was time to take action. I decided to write a formal complaint. It wasn't just going to be about me. I would expose everything. I would gather the community, and we would take a stand. The letter was long and detailed, outlining all the rules Agnes had implemented illegally, the fines she had collected, and the 911 call that had triggered everything. But I couldn't send it alone. I needed signatures. I needed people to stand with me. At first, it was hard to convince people. Many of them were still afraid of Agnes. They didn't want to get involved. But little by little, I managed to convince them that we couldn't just let her keep doing this. I wasn't asking for a fight. I was asking for justice. The morning I finally gathered enough signatures to send the letter to Agnes, I felt a strange mix of dread and excitement. This was it. The point of no return. If she received this letter, there was no going back. She would know we were on to her. The stakes had never been higher. I hand-delivered the letter to her house. When I handed it to her, I could see her face redden with fury. She looked up at me, her eyes narrowing with disdain. "You think you're going to ruin everything I've built here," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. I didn't say a word. I just turned and walked away. But in my chest, something was rising. A sense of power. Agnes had built her empire on fear, but now, that fear was about to crumble. I had finally called her bluff. But as I walked back to my cabin, the weight of what I had just done hit me. There was no going back now. I had opened a door, and I didn't know what would be waiting on the other side. But I knew one thing: I couldn't let Agnes destroy me. And I wasn't the only one who felt that way. The following days were a blur of emotions. Part of me felt relieved, like a weight had been lifted. But another part of me felt the undeniable tension that comes with challenging someone who had controlled everything for so long. Agnes wasn't going to let this go easily. She would fight back, and I had no illusions about what she was capable of. But as the community began to rally behind me, something incredible happened. They began to believe, too. And I could feel that belief fueling my resolve. I had expected Agnes to retaliate immediately. But instead, for a few days, there was a strange calm. Perhaps she thought I would back down. Maybe she assumed that her position was too strong to be shaken. But I wasn't backing down, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized something else. This wasn't just about fighting back against her, it was about reclaiming our community. The truth is, we'd all been living under her thumb for so long that we didn't even realize how much control she had until it was too late. Now, people were waking up to the reality that what Agnes had been doing was not just overreach, it was illegal. Every rule, every fine, every threat had been carefully orchestrated to make her look powerful. She had created a world where no one questioned her, where everyone lived in fear of her wrath. But now that we had exposed her, it felt like the entire neighborhood had been holding its breath, waiting for the air to finally clear. I didn't expect the first reaction to come from Davies. A few days after delivering the letter, he came over to my cabin, his face grim. "Ben," he said, as I opened the door. "I've been thinking. We need to be ready for her response. Agnes won't go down without a fight." I nodded, feeling a sense of solidarity that I hadn't felt before. This wasn't just my battle anymore. "What do you think she'll do?" I asked. "I think she'll try to bury everything," he said, his voice low. "She's going to try to cover her tracks, and she'll do it any way she can. It's her last-ditch effort to stay in control." I looked at him, the realization sinking in that this wasn't just about legal action anymore. We were up against someone who wasn't afraid to go to any lengths to keep her power. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of her anymore. In fact, I was ready to take whatever she threw at me. I just needed to stay ahead of her. The following Saturday, we scheduled a community meeting. The letter I had delivered to Agnes had clearly shaken her. The response was swift and predictable. The very next day, she called for a meeting of the HOA board, which she claimed was to discuss the recent complaints about unfair regulation enforcement. She was going to try to spin this as a personal attack on her character. She would try to turn the community against me, to make me out as the troublemaker, the one causing division. She would try to do what she always did, control the narrative. I wasn't going to let her. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was everyone's fight. And I had to make sure that the entire community knew exactly what was at stake. We needed transparency, but more importantly, we needed accountability. By the time the community meeting rolled around, the room was packed. Over 30 people had shown up. I had never seen the neighborhood so alive with energy that wasn't born out of fear, but of hope. People were finally talking, finally asking questions, and for the first time in months, Agnes was no longer in control. Agnes arrived at the meeting with her usual air of authority. She tried to assert herself from the very beginning, standing tall and giving her rehearsed speech about how difficult the recent accusations had been. She positioned herself as the victim, as if we were all attacking her when, in fact, she had been the one attacking us. I stood up to address the group. My heart was racing as I opened the folder that Davies had given me, filled with all the documents we had gathered over the past few days. I wasn't just going to tell them what I had discovered, I was going to show them. I appreciate everyone being here tonight, I began, my voice steady, despite the nerves. But there are things that need to be said. Things that have been hidden for far too long. I could feel Agnes tense as I spoke, but I kept my focus on the community, on the neighbors who had finally begun to listen. I walked them through the original HOA charter, showing them the sections that clearly stated how any regulation affecting property rights had to be approved by a majority vote of the entire community, not just the board. I showed them the fines that had been imposed, the rules that had been arbitrarily created, and the 911 call that had set this whole chain of events in motion. The room was dead silent. No one spoke. It wasn't just the information that was shocking, it was the realization that Agnes had been operating outside the law, without anyone realizing it. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I addressed Agnes directly. "You've been lying to all of us," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. "This isn't about community values. This is about control, power, and manipulation. You've been hiding behind rules that you've made up, using fear and intimidation to get what you want. And it ends tonight." The silence that followed was profound. I could see the looks on my neighbors' faces, some of them were angry, some were in disbelief, but most were relieved. They were finally seeing the truth. Agnes' grip on the community was slipping. But Agnes wasn't going to go down without a fight. She stood up, her hands trembling, her voice rising in anger. "You're wrong, Ben. I've been protecting this community for years. These people need guidance. They need leadership." Her words were falling flat. The room wasn't buying it anymore. As she ranted, I saw something shift in the crowd. A growing collective realization that they had been lied to, manipulated, and controlled. They had believed in her because she had made them afraid to question her. But now, that fear was being replaced by something far more powerful, the truth. Agnes tried to regain control, but the damage was done. I could see it in her eyes, she knew she had lost. She knew the walls were closing in, and for the first time, she didn't have the power to make it stop. The meeting ended in chaos, but the next morning, things began to change. Agnes' influence had evaporated overnight. People started sharing their stories, showing each other the fines they had received, the rules they had been forced to follow without their consent. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was our fight. And we were going to win. The next few days felt surreal. The shift in the neighborhood was palpable. It was as though everyone had taken off their blindfolds, and now they were seeing clearly for the first time. Conversations that had once been whispered behind closed doors were now happening out in the open, and the feeling of collective empowerment was contagious. I couldn't help but feel proud of what we had accomplished, but deep down, I knew the battle wasn't over. Agnes wasn't someone who would just walk away quietly. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she still had one card to play. I spent that weekend in my cabin, trying to relax for the first time in months. The sun was setting over the lake, casting a golden glow across the water. It should have been peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Agnes wouldn't give up without a fight. Sure enough, early Monday morning, I received an email from her. It was short, direct, and threatening. "Mr. Turner, I know what you've been doing. Don't think I'll just sit idly by while you try to dismantle everything I've worked for. You've made a grave mistake, and you'll regret it. I suggest you back off before things escalate further." The message was clear: Agnes wasn't just going to give up. But what I had learned over the past few weeks was that she had been bluffing the entire time. She had no real power left. The lies she had built her empire on were crumbling, and all I had to do now was push just a little bit harder to expose her once and for all. I met with Franklin Vance that afternoon at his home. We had spent hours over the past few days going over every piece of evidence we had gathered, and now, it was time to make our final move. He was an experienced lawyer, and his demeanor had shifted from one of cautious optimism to full-blown determination. "We've got her, Ben," Franklin said, his voice low but confident. "But now, it's about making sure the state sees this for what it truly is. We've got to get everything into their hands. This isn't just about you and Agnes anymore, it's about holding her accountable for everything she's done." I nodded. It was time. But I couldn't help but think about everything that had led me here. It wasn't just about the fines, the rules, or the constant surveillance. It was about the people Agnes had hurt, the lives she had disrupted for nothing more than her own twisted sense of control. I thought of Davies, the elderly man who had quietly supported me from the start. I thought of Mark, who had been fined for using power tools in his own garage. I thought of Stella, who had simply wanted to share her artwork with the community. They had all suffered at the hands of a woman who thought she was above the law. Now, it was our turn to make her pay. We spent the rest of the day preparing our final complaint to the state. It was a thick stack of paperwork, testimonies, financial records, and every illegal rule Agnes had ever enforced. It was irrefutable. When we were finished, Franklin sealed the envelope with a finality that made it feel real. It was no longer just about taking down an HOA president. It was about exposing the entire fraudulent system she had created. By the time we filed the complaint, Agnes had already been informed that an official investigation was underway. But she didn't know the full extent of what we had on her. Her smug confidence had been replaced with an unmistakable panic, and when the investigators arrived at her home just days later, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed once again. I watched from my cabin window as two state investigators pulled up to Agnes' house early in the morning. They were sharp, professional, and determined. They weren't here for a friendly chat, they were here to dismantle everything she had built. It was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when the truth would finally come to light. The investigators spent hours inside her home, going through her records, her papers, and anything else they could find that might tie her to the fraud she had orchestrated. The neighbors watched from their windows, some cautiously curious, others eager for the truth to be revealed. I could feel the tension building in the air. No one knew exactly what would happen next, but one thing was clear: Agnes was done. The following week was even more intense. Word had spread that Agnes was under investigation for financial fraud, misuse of emergency services, and even harassment. The quiet, peaceful neighborhood that had once been afraid of speaking up was now brimming with whispers of justice. People who had once been too afraid to challenge Agnes were coming forward with their own stories, stories of unlawful fines, threats, and intimidation tactics that had plagued this community for far too long. But then, as the days went by, we learned something even more shocking. Agnes had a history. She had been running similar schemes in other neighborhoods before ours. She had made a habit of manipulating HOA rules and using the police as her personal enforcement arm. Her reign of terror stretched far beyond our small community, and now, it was all coming to light. She wasn't just a petty HOA president with a vendetta, she was a criminal, and her empire was falling apart. The state investigators were thorough, and their findings were damning. Agnes had been siphoning funds from the HOA for personal gain, using fake invoices and falsified documents to cover her tracks. She had been collecting fines for violations of rules that had never been voted on by the community. And perhaps most damning of all, she had misused the 911 emergency system multiple times to harass residents who dared to challenge her. As the investigation progressed, Agnes' house went up for sale. It wasn't just the financial strain she was facing, it was the fact that she couldn't look any of her neighbors in the eye anymore. The people she had once controlled with fear were now standing together, demanding justice, and there was no way she could escape the consequences of her actions. In the weeks that followed, the mood in the neighborhood shifted from fear to hope. The new HOA board was elected, and it was a breath of fresh air. People who had once been silent were now speaking out, demanding transparency and fairness. The new board began the process of dismantling the corrupt system that Agnes had built, returning the community to its original principles of equality and respect. And as for Agnes? She faded into the background, quietly leaving the neighborhood she had once controlled. The people she had oppressed were finally free. The final days of Agnes' reign felt strangely anticlimactic. As the investigators continued to sift through her documents and financial records, the weight of what had been uncovered began to sink in. The small, seemingly insignificant event of her 911 call had spiraled into a full-scale investigation that revealed just how deep her corruption ran. The truth had a way of creeping out from the shadows, exposing the darkness that people like Agnes had worked so hard to hide. In the end, it wasn't just about a series of fraudulent fines or an HOA president who had misused her position. It was about the lives she had destroyed along the way. It was about the people who had been harassed, the families that had been financially burdened, and the sense of community that had been shattered under her authoritarian rule. Agnes wasn't just a woman who wanted to control her neighborhood, she was a person who had exploited the trust of everyone around her, using power and manipulation to fuel her own ego. But now, that power was slipping through her fingers. I remember the day the investigators finally left her house. They didn't say much as they loaded their cars with evidence. Their job wasn't over yet, but the decision had been made. They had seen enough. And now, the community's attention shifted from fear to something new, anxiety mixed with a burning sense of justice. We knew that Agnes' time was up, but there was still one final hurdle to clear. As the hearing date approached, the weight of the situation settled into every corner of the neighborhood. People were nervous, uncertain about how it would all unfold. But one thing was clear, we couldn't go back to the way things were. We had uncovered the truth, and we were going to make sure that truth was heard. The night before the hearing, I found myself standing on my cabin's porch once more, staring out at the lake. The water was still, reflecting the sky above like a perfect mirror. It was a beautiful sight, but it felt different now. The sense of calm I had once felt here had been replaced by something more powerful, a feeling of unity. We were no longer alone in this fight. The neighborhood had come together in ways I hadn't imagined possible. I thought back to the early days of my time here. I had come to this cabin for peace, for solace. It was a place that reminded me of my father, a place that held my memories and my sense of self. But what had once been a refuge had become a battleground. And as I stood there in the cool evening air, I realized something. We had all fought for something bigger than ourselves. This wasn't just about me. It was about taking a stand against a system that had allowed one person to wield power over others for far too long. I wasn't just fighting for my right to kayak on a peaceful Saturday morning anymore. I was fighting for everyone who had been afraid to speak up. I was fighting for the future of this community, for a chance to rebuild what had been broken by one woman's thirst for control. The next morning, I walked into the courtroom with a quiet confidence I hadn't felt in a long time. The courtroom was packed with residents, all of us there to witness the final chapter of this bizarre, emotional journey. Agnes was already sitting at the front table with her lawyer. She looked pale and defeated, her once pristine aura of authority shattered. Gone was the smug smile that had once seemed so unshakable. She was just a woman, now, desperate and cornered, trying to salvage what was left of her crumbling empire. When the hearing began, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The judge, a stern but fair woman, listened patiently as the state investigators presented their findings. The evidence was damning, and Agnes' lawyer seemed to shrink further into his chair with each passing minute. The truth was undeniable. There was no way she could escape what she had done. Then came the final twist. Agnes, in a last-ditch attempt to save herself, tried to use her charm to sway the room. She claimed that the HOA's policies had been implemented for the greater good of the community, that they were necessary to preserve property values and maintain harmony. But the evidence didn't lie. The documents she had presented as proof were fake. Her claims had no substance. The community was done being manipulated. Franklin stood, his voice steady and filled with the weight of his legal expertise. Your Honor, the issue here is not whether the rules were beneficial. It's whether they were legal. And they weren't. He pointed directly at Agnes. The defendant here has systematically abused her position, falsified documents, misused emergency services, and subjected an entire community to her fraudulent authority. This is not just a civil matter. It is a criminal one. The room was silent as the judge took in everything that had been presented. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. Agnes Thompson, this court finds you guilty of financial fraud, abuse of authority, misuse of emergency services, and tampering with evidence. You will pay the fines imposed by the state, return all stolen funds to the HOA, and be permanently banned from serving in any HOA capacity. Your actions have caused unnecessary harm to this community, and you will be held accountable. It was over. The room erupted into applause. The weight of the last few months lifted off my shoulders in an instant. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. The nightmare was over. Agnes was gone, and the community was free to heal. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to rebuild. The new HOA board, democratically elected and led by people who actually cared about the community, made changes that were long overdue. The once overbearing rules were rolled back, and a new sense of peace and unity began to take root. Agnes, on the other hand, had no choice but to leave. Her house was sold, and she was no longer welcome in the community she had once controlled. The neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up now stood tall, proud of what they had accomplished. And I, for the first time in months, could return to my peaceful lake cabin, knowing that justice had been served. In the end, it wasn't just about a kayak or a neighbor dispute. It was about standing up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. It was about finding the courage to speak out against corruption and abuse, and refusing to let it continue. Agnes had thought she could break me. But in the end, it was her own actions that destroyed her. And as I paddled out onto the lake once more, I realized that the true power of this community wasn't in the rules we followed, but in the strength we found when we stood together. It had been a long and painful journey, but we had won. And that made it all worth it. Thank you for reading, and for sharing in this journey. If you have your own story of standing up against injustice, or if you've ever had a fight like this in your own neighborhood, I'd love to hear it. Drop it in the comments below.